Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt of the Stone Creek Ranch yard, and the sound was a flat, final thud in the vast, indifferent silence of the high country. The dust, the color of old rust, rose in a lazy puff around her worn boot hems and settled again, coating everything in a film of weary despair. Beside her, her son, Leo, a small, silent 6-year-old with eyes the gray of creek stones after rain, clutched a fold of her skirt. He did not look at the ramshackle barn, nor the long, low ranch house with its sagging porch, nor the man who now stood on that porch, wiping his hands on a rag, his face a mask of tired suspicion. Leo looked only at his mother's hand, the one not gripping the handle of a bag, as if it were the last true thing in the world. She looked at the man on the porch, Jedediah Stone. He was the owner, the gatekeeper, the end of a very long and desperate road. He was leaner than she had imagined, from the description she'd been given in the dusty town 3 days' walk back. His frame was all wire and bone, his face carved by sun and worry into a landscape of hard lines. He had the look of a man who had been carrying a heavy weight alone for too long, and who had learned to trust nothing and no one, especially not a woman and a child who appeared out of the shimmering heat haze with nothing but 2 bags and the clothes on their backs. "Looking for a handout?" he called, his voice raspy, not unkind, but utterly devoid of welcome. "Church ladies are in town on Sundays. This is a working ranch." Cora felt the familiar, hot prickle of shame, but she pushed it down. Shame was a luxury. It was food she could not eat, a roof she could not sleep under. She had traded it for resolve somewhere on the long, dusty track that had led her here. She took a breath, the air thin and tasting of dust and distant pines. Then she said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say, the thing that stripped away all pretense of choice. "I'm not looking for a handout, Mr. Stone. I'm looking for a job, and I hear you're in need of a housekeeper." A dry, humorless chuckle escaped him. "Heard that, did you? The last one lasted 2 weeks," said the quiet drover mad. "Before that, it was an old fella who drank my cooking whiskey and set the dish towels on fire." He tossed the rag onto a railing. "This place, it ain't for everybody. It ain't for most folks." He looked from her to the boy, his gaze lingering on Leo's unnaturally still form. "And it sure as hell ain't for a woman with a child." It was the dismissal she had expected, the one she had heard in a dozen other forms for the last 6 months. But here, at what felt like the edge of the world, she had no more road to walk. This was it. This was the place she either took root or withered completely. "My son is quiet," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in her gut. "And I am not most folks." As if the universe sought to test that very statement, a sudden commotion erupted from the direction of a small, fenced-in paddock near the barn. A young hand, wiry and flushed, came running, waving his hat. "Jed, it's the calf. She's down again. I think this is it." Jedediah Stone's shoulders slumped, the weight he carried seeming to double in that instant. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound of pure frustration. He started to move, then stopped, remembering his unwanted visitors. He turned back to Cora, his expression hard. "You see, this ranch is dying on its feet. I'm losing calves, my hands are quitting, and I'm one bad winter away from handing the keys to Marcus Thorne. I can't afford another mouth, let alone 2. Cora's gaze shifted from Jed's face to the paddock. She could see the small, dun-colored form of a calf lying on its side, its mother lowing pitifully nearby. She saw the young hand, Billy, trying to coax it up, his movements frantic and useless. She saw the sickness in the animal's posture, the dullness of its coat. It was scours, most likely. Dehydration. She knew the signs. She had seen it 100 times on her own family's ranch, the one that was now just a memory sold for pennies on the dollar to pay off debts. This was it. The moment. The tiny, desperate crack in the wall of his refusal. She did not plead. She did not beg. She made a wager. "That calf is dehydrated," Cora said, her voice cutting through the air with an authority that made Jedediah blink. "You've been giving it water, but it's not taking it, or it's running right through. It needs electrolytes, it needs warmth, it needs a mash of boiled barley, molasses, and a pinch of salt, fed to it in small doses from a bottle with a rag on the end." Jed stared at her. The young hand, Billy, had paused in his panicked efforts and was also staring. "You've got barley in your storeroom," Cora continued, her eyes scanning the layout of the ranch, her mind working, calculating. "I saw the sacks through the open door. You've got a milk cow, so there's a spare bucket and bottles somewhere. Your kitchen is a disaster, but the stove looks sound. I can have a mash ready in 30 minutes. She looked him square in the eye, her chin lifted. Give me 30 days, Mr. Stone. I'll save your calf. I'll run your house, cook your meals, mend your clothes, and manage your supplies. I'll prove to you I'm worth more than any two hands you could hire for twice the pay. If, at the end of those 30 days, you don't think I've earned my keep and then some, my son and I will walk away. No wages owed. The silence that followed was profound. It was broken only by the sad call of the mother cow and the whisper of the wind through the eaves of the barn. Jedediah Stone looked at the woman before him. She wasn't pleading, she wasn't begging. She was laying out terms like a general before a battle. Her clothes were worn but clean. Her face was thin with hardship, but her eyes were clear and direct. There was no trace of guile in them, only a deep, weary competence. He looked at the dying calf, a symbol of his own failing enterprise. He looked at the boy, who had not moved a muscle. He looked back at the woman. What did he have to lose? Another calf? A little barley? He gave a slow, reluctant nod. It was barely a movement, more a surrender to the sheer, stubborn force of her will. The barley is in the lean-to off the kitchen, he said, his voice flat. Molasses is on the shelf above it. Don't make a mess you can't clean. It was not a welcome. It was not an offer. It was a challenge. And for Cora Halloran, it was the first rung on a ladder out of a very deep, very dark hole. She nodded once, a gesture as clipped and final as his own. Leo, she said softly, you wait here on the porch. Do not move from that spot. The boy looked up at her, gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, and walked to the steps, sitting down with a formal stillness that was heartbreaking to behold. Cora picked up her bags, her knuckles white, and walked past Jedediah Stone and into the dark, unfamiliar territory of the Stone Creek ranch house. She had 30 days. Clear's throat. The first thing that hit Cora inside the house was the smell. It was a stale, layered odor of old grease, unwashed bodies, cold coffee, and a deep, underlying note of masculine neglect. The kitchen was a testament to chaos. Dirty plates were stacked precariously on a dry sink. A cast-iron skillet crusted with the remains of a week's worth of eggs sat cold on the stove, and the floor was a geography of mud tracks and spilled flour. For a moment, her resolve wavered. This was not just untidy, it was a space that had given up. But then she remembered the look on Jedediah's face, the exhausted defeat. She remembered the stillness of her son on the porch. Giving up was not an option. Work was an option. Work was the only thing she had left. She set her bags down in a corner she deemed cleanest and surveyed the room not as a mess, but as a series of tasks. First, the calf. She found the lean-to, a cool, dark space that smelled of earth and grain. The sacks of barley were there, as promised. She located a small tin of molasses, sticky but usable, and a canister of salt. Back in the kitchen, she ignored the siren call of the dirty dishes and went straight to the stove. She had to coax it to life, clearing out old ash and using the last few splinters of kindling in the wood box. As the fire caught, she filled a pot with water from the pump at the sink, her movements economical, born of years of practice. While the water heated, she began to impose order. She cleared a space on the large central table, wiping it down with a damp rag she found hanging by the sink. She gathered the dirty dishes, scraping them into a slop bucket for the pigs she'd glimpsed behind the barn. She pumped water into a large basin, setting it on the warming stove to heat for washing. Every action was deliberate, unhurried, without a single wasted motion. This was her language, the grammar of competence. She couldn't explain her worth in fine words, but she could demonstrate it in the steady rhythm of work well done. The barley boiled, softening into a fragrant mash. She stirred in the molasses and the pinch of salt, the sweet, earthy smell beginning to push back against the stale air in the kitchen. She found an old beer bottle, cleaned it thoroughly, and fashioned a nipple from a strip of clean cloth she tore from a worn-out shirt in her own bag. It wasn't ideal, but it would work. She poured the warm, thin gruel into the bottle and wrapped it in another rag to keep it from cooling too quickly. When she stepped back out into the yard, the sun was lower, casting long shadows from the corral posts. Jedediah was standing over the calf, his hat in his hands, his posture one of grim acceptance. Billy, the young hand, sat on the top rail of the fence, looking desolate. Neither of them seemed to notice her approach until she was right there, holding out the bottle. Keep its head up, she said, her voice calm and low so as not to spook the animal further. Gently. Jed looked from the bottle to her face, skepticism warring with a sliver of something else. Hope, maybe. He knelt, sliding his hands carefully under the calf's neck. Billy hopped down from the fence, his eyes wide with curiosity. Cora knelt on the other side, the dust soiling the knees of her dress. She spoke softly to the animal, a stream of low, meaningless sounds meant to soothe. She touched the rag nipple to the calf's dry lips. At first, there was no response. The calf's eyes were dull, half closed. Cora persisted, gently rubbing the rag against its mouth, squeezing a single drop of the warm liquid onto its tongue. There was a flicker of movement, a weak, instinctive suckling motion. Cora kept the pressure steady, her hand unwavering. The calf sucked again, then again, its movements gaining a fragile rhythm. A small crowd had gathered. 2 other hands had drifted over from the barn, drawn by the quiet drama. One was a man well past middle age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands gnarled around a piece of leather he was braiding. This was Abel, the quiet observer. The other was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, his expression sullen and resentful. Silas. He watched with his arms crossed, his disapproval a palpable force. Cora paid them no mind. Her world had shrunk to the space between her and the small, struggling life in her hands. She fed the calf slowly, letting it rest, giving it time to swallow. It took nearly 20 minutes to empty half the bottle. When she was done, the calf gave a low sigh and its breathing seemed a fraction less shallow. It wasn't a miracle. It was a start. It needs to be kept warm, she said, looking at Jed. A bed of clean straw in the barn, away from drafts. And more of this in 2 hours. Jedediah Stone stared at the calf, which now seemed to be resting rather than dying. He looked at the empty space on its lips where the bottle had been. Then he looked at Cora. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer a word of praise. He simply stood up, his joints cracking, and said to the young hand, "Billy, you heard her. Clean straw in the empty stall. Gently now." He turned and walked back toward the house without a backward glance. But as he walked, his shoulders seemed a little less slumped. It was the first, almost imperceptible shift. From his vantage point on the porch, Leo watched his mother rise from the dust, her face smudged but her back straight. He watched the men carry the calf into the barn. He watched it all and said nothing. By the time the sun had fully set, casting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the kitchen of the Stone Creek Ranch was unrecognizable. The stove gleamed, its nickel trim polished. The floor had been swept and scrubbed. The mountain of dishes was washed, dried, and stacked neatly on open shelves. And from the oven, a smell was wafting through the entire house. A smell so alien and yet so deeply familiar that it stopped each of the ranch hands in their tracks as they came in for their evening meal. It was the smell of baking bread. The men filed in, their boots loud on the clean floor. They stopped in the doorway, momentarily stunned into silence. Billy's jaw dropped. Abel, the old hand, stopped his braiding and inhaled deeply, a flicker of something ancient and pleased in his eyes. Even Silas looked momentarily confused, his sullen expression faltering. They were used to grabbing a plate of cold beans or whatever was left in the pot from the day before. They were not used to this. Cora stood at the stove, stirring a large pot. She had found a passable dress in her bag, a dark calico, and had twisted her hair up off her neck. She looked as if she belonged there. On the table, which was now covered with a clean, if patched, tablecloth she had also unearthed from her bag, sat a platter of sliced beef stewed with onions and carrots, a bowl of boiled potatoes, and, in the center of it all, 2 loaves of freshly baked bread, their crusts a perfect golden brown. "Supper's ready," she said simply, not looking at them. "Wash up at the basin outside." For a beat, no one moved. It was a tableau. The stunned men, the transformed room, and the woman at the center of it, calmly stirring gravy. Then, Abel, the old sage, moved first. He walked to the door, took the bar of soap from the nail, and began to lather his hands at the outdoor pump. Billy followed his lead, grinning. After a moment of hesitation, the other hands did the same. Only Silas remained, leaning against the doorframe, his arms still crossed. "Ain't seen a fuss like this since the boss's wife was alive," he grumbled, though the words lacked their intended bite. They sounded less like an accusation and more like a reluctant admission. Cora did not rise to the bait. She simply placed a stack of clean plates on the table. "There's enough for everyone," she said. And for Mr. Stone. Jedediah came in last. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw the clean room, the ordered shelves. He saw the faces of his men, washed and waiting with an almost boyish anticipation. He smelled the bread. He looked at the table, laden with a meal, the likes of which hadn't been served in that house in a decade. He looked at Cora, who was now ladling stew onto a plate for her son, Leo, who sat on a crate near the stove, small and silent. Jed's gaze went from the boy to the woman. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost mesmerizing. There was no wasted energy, no clatter of panic, just a steady, methodical grace. He saw her check the clock on the mantel, her mind clearly already on the calf's next feeding. He saw the weariness in the lines around her eyes, but also the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was a general marshalling her forces, bringing order to a territory long lost to chaos. He sat down at the head of the table, the spot that had been his alone for years. The men took their usual places. Cora placed a full plate in front of him, then one for herself. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the long, rough-hewn table was full. The meal began in an unaccustomed silence, broken only by the sound of forks against plates. The stew was rich, the potatoes were perfectly cooked, but it was the bread that changed everything. It was soft, warm, and real. It tasted of care. Billy, the young hand, was the first to speak, his mouth full. "Ma'am," he said, looking at Cora with open admiration. "I ain't had bread this good, ever." Cora gave him a small, tired smile. "It's just bread, Billy." "No, ma'am," he insisted. "It ain't." Abel, the old man, grunted in agreement, tearing off another piece with his gnarled fingers. He caught Cora's eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a formal commendation. It was an acknowledgement of skill, a sign of respect from one craftsman to another. From the other end of the table, Silas watched this exchange, his fork stilled over his plate. He chewed his beef slowly, his eyes narrowed, calculating. He saw the easy way Billy spoke to her, the deference in Abel's nod. He saw the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had been the de facto second-in-command for years, his position secured by tenure and bluster. This woman, with her quiet competence and her transformative bread, was a threat. Later that night, after the kitchen was once again spotless and the men had retired to the bunkhouse, their conversation a low, wondering murmur, Cora slipped out to the barn. The air was cool and smelled of hay and animals. A single lantern cast a warm, golden pool of light in the darkness. In the stall, the calf was sleeping on its bed of clean straw. Its breathing was even, and when Cora laid a hand on its flank, it felt warm to the touch. It was going to live. She turned to leave and nearly ran into Jedediah Stone. He was standing in the shadows, watching her. He held out a bundle of old blankets. "The nights get cold," he said. It wasn't an apology or a thank you, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that she would be here when the night got cold. "Thank you," she said, taking them. The wool was rough against her skin. He gestured with his chin toward the stall. "You knew what to do." It was a statement, not a question. "My father raised cattle," she said simply. "Before that, his father. Some things you don't forget." He just nodded, his eyes unreadable in the gloom. He looked from her to the small space she had cleared in the hayloft for herself and Leo, a temporary nest high above the barn floor. "The house has rooms," he said, his voice gruff. "One in the back. It's small, has its own door." Cora clutched the blankets to her chest. This was it. Another rung on the ladder. "We'll move in the morning," she said. "I need to be near the calf tonight. Its fever might break." Jedediah looked at her for a long moment, at the stubborn set of her shoulders, the smudge of dirt still on her cheek she had been too busy to notice, the utter lack of self-pity in her stance. He had hired a housekeeper, or rather a housekeeper had hired herself. But as he stood there in the quiet of his own barn, listening to the sound of his own ranch breathing around him, a sound that for the first time in a long time did not sound like a death rattle, he had the strange and unsettling feeling that he had gotten something entirely different. He had gotten a woman who knew about fevers and bargains and bread. And he was no longer sure who was on trial here, Cora Halloran or the Stone Creek Ranch itself. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. dictated not by the sun's rise and fall, but by the steady, purposeful cadence of Cora's work. The small back room Jedediah had offered her was sparse, containing little more than a narrow bedstead and a small chest of drawers. But Cora transformed it. She scrubbed the floorboards until the pine scent rose from the wood, washed the single window until the morning light streamed in clear and bright, and covered the lumpy mattress with a clean sheet and one of the blankets Jed had given her. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a safe harbor, and it had a door that locked. Her influence spread outward from that small room like ripples in a pond. The ranch house, once a place the men entered only to eat and sleep, began to feel like a center again. The smell of baking bread or simmering stew now permanently perfumed the air. Mended shirts appeared, neatly folded on the foot of the men's bunks. The supply ledgers, previously a chaotic jumble of receipts and scrawled notes, were now organized in a neat stack on the corner of the desk in Jed's office, their columns of figures clear and balanced. Cora moved through her days with a focus that bordered on serene. She was up before dawn, her first trip to the barn to check on the calf, which was now not only standing, but beginning to frisk and butt its head against her hand. She would milk the cow, her movements sure and rhythmic, the sound of the milk hitting the pail a steady, comforting percussion in the quiet morning. Then it was to the kitchen, to start the bread and the coffee, the fire in the big stove, a constant beating heart she tended with expert care. Billy, the young hand, became her shadow and her first true ally. He was fascinated by her competence, by the way she could soothe a spooked horse with a low word, or calculate a month's worth of flour with a few quick strokes of a pencil. He began to find excuses to be near the house, offering to carry the heavy water buckets or split extra kindling for the wood box. He was especially taken with Leo. He saw the boy's silence not as a lack, but as a depth. One afternoon, he approached the porch where Leo sat, as always, watching the world go by. He held out his hand. In his palm was a small, crudely but lovingly carved wooden horse. "For you," Billy said, his voice soft. "Every fella needs a horse." Leo looked at the carving, then up at Billy's earnest, open face. He hesitated, then slowly, his small fingers barely brushing Billy's calloused palm, he took the horse. He held it, turning it over and over, his thumb tracing the lines of its mane. He did not say thank you. But for the first time since they had arrived, a flicker of something other than watchfulness appeared in his eyes. It was the beginning of a thaw. Cora, watching from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough, felt a knot of tension in her own chest loosen. Abel, the old hand, showed his approval in his own quiet way. He began leaving small offerings on the back step, a string of freshly caught trout from the creek, a handful of wild berries he'd found on the ridge, a perfectly shaped piece of cedar that he knew would burn with a clean, sweet scent in the stove. They were never accompanied by a word, only a slight dip of his head if their paths happened to cross. It was the silent language of the high country, a dialogue of deeds, not words, and Cora understood it perfectly. But not all were won over. Silas, the resistor, grew more sullen as Cora's influence grew. He saw her order as a personal affront, her efficiency as a judgment on his own years of complacent authority. He saw the respect in the other men's eyes and interpreted it as a loss of his own standing. He began a campaign of small rebellions and muttered complaints, always just loud enough for Cora to hear. "Woman's work should stay in the house," he grumbled to one of the other hands, as he watched Cora expertly re-shoe a mule that had thrown a shoe, a task none of them had been eager to tackle. "Ain't natural, her being out here." "She's doing it faster than you would have, Silas," the other hand retorted, earning a black look. He took to leaving his boots caked with mud on the clean kitchen floor, or leaving the tack room in disarray after he'd used it. They were petty acts of sabotage, designed to test her, to provoke a reaction. Cora, however, refused to be provoked. She simply cleaned the floor without comment and organized the tack room without complaint. Her lack of reaction seemed to infuriate him more than any angry outburst would have. The confrontation, when it came, was not over muddy boots or a messy tack room. It was over a sack of oats. Cora was in the office, a small, dusty room off the main living space that Jedediah rarely used. She was going over the supply ledgers, a task she had taken upon herself. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. The numbers weren't adding up. The amount of feed they were buying from the supplier in town didn't seem to match the amount of feed they had, or the rate at which the animals were consuming it. There was a steady, consistent leak somewhere. Silas appeared in the doorway, blocking the light. "Boss wants to know when that fancy supper's going to be ready," he said, his tone insolent. Cora did not look up from the ledger. She held a skillet in her lap, not as a weapon, but because she had been about to clean it when she'd been sidetracked by the numbers. Her hands were still smudged with grease. "Supper is at 6, Silas, as it is every night." She made a small mark on the page with her pencil. "I need to ask you about the last feed delivery. The ledger says 20 sacks of oats were delivered on the 10th. I can only account for 18 in the storeroom." Silas bristled. His face darkened. "You accusing me of something?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Cora said, her voice still level, her eyes still on the page. "I am stating a fact. There are 2 sacks of oats missing. I'm trying to determine if it was a short delivery or if they were stored somewhere else." "Maybe your fancy numbers are wrong," he sneered. "Maybe a woman ought to stick to cooking and leave the ranching to men." At that, Cora finally looked up. She set the skillet down on the desk with a soft, deliberate thud. Her eyes were not angry. They were clear and cold as ice water. "I ran my family's ranch for 2 years after my husband died, Silas. I kept it afloat through drought and disease with 50 head of cattle and 1 hired hand half my age. I know how to count sacks of oats." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "And I know the look of a man who sells a couple of sacks for whiskey money in town, thinking no one will be smart enough to notice." Silas's face went from red to a pasty white. He took a half step into the room, his hands clenching into fists. "Why, you little—" "That's enough, Silas." The voice came from the doorway behind him. It was Jedediah. He had been standing there for the last minute, drawn by the raised voices. He held a bridle in his hand, his knuckles white. His face was like granite. He looked past Silas's shoulder at Cora, who sat calm and composed behind the desk, then back at his fuming ranch hand. "She's out of line, boss," Silas sputtered, trying to regain his footing. "Accusing me? I heard what she said," Jed cut in, his voice dangerously quiet. "She stated a fact and asked a question. You're the one who got loud." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space. He looked at the ledger on the desk, then at Silas. "I've been wondering why my feed bills were so high. Now I think I know." He jerked his head toward the door. "Go draw your pay. I want you off this ranch by sunrise." Silas stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked from Jed's implacable face to Cora's steady gaze. He saw no weakness, no gloating, only a quiet, unassailable certainty. He had picked a fight with the wrong person and lost completely. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the bunkhouse door behind him. The office was suddenly very quiet. Jedediah looked at Cora. She'd already picked up the skillet again and was inspecting a spot of rust on its underside. She had won, but she took no pleasure in it. She had simply removed an obstacle. "He's been with me for 10 years, Jed said, his voice low. He sounded tired. "He's been stealing from you for some of them," Cora replied, not unkindly. She began to scrub at the rust spot with a bit of sand she kept in a small tin for just that purpose. Jed watched her hands, the small, circular motions, methodical, purposeful. He had trusted Silas. He had been betrayed again, but this time, it was different. This time someone had been watching the books. Someone had been paying attention. He had let this woman onto his ranch out of a moment of desperate curiosity, and in less than 2 weeks, she had saved a calf, transformed his home, earned the respect of his best men, and exposed a thief he had trusted for a decade. He looked at the ledger, at the neat columns and the clear, concise notes in the margins. It was more than bookkeeping. It was a map of his own blindness. He had been so consumed with the large, visible failures, the dying cattle, the broken fences, that he hadn't seen the slow, steady bleed of 1,000 smaller betrayals. "The 30 days are not up," Cora said quietly, as if reading his mind. "The terms of our agreement still stand." Jedediah let out a long breath. He leaned against the door frame, the bridle forgotten in his hand. "No," he said, his voice rough with a feeling he couldn't name. "I don't think they do." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a temporary housekeeper or a desperate widow, but as a force of nature that had swept into his life and begun to set it right. "I think the terms have changed." Cora's hand stilled. She looked up at him, her gray eyes questioning. "I hired you to keep house," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "But you're not a housekeeper, are you, Mrs. Halloran?" "My name is Cora," she said softly. "Cora," he repeated. The name felt solid, real. He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked over to the desk. He picked up the ledger, feeling the weight of it, the order she had imposed on his chaos. You found this, something I should have seen years ago. He tapped the page. What else have you seen? It was a new kind of question. It wasn't about supper or mending. It was a question asked of a partner. A trust was being offered, a heavy, fragile thing. Cora understood its significance immediately. This was the true test, far more important than saving a single calf. This was the moment she transitioned from employee to advisor, from outsider to insider. She took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts. For the past 2 weeks, while her hands were busy with dough or laundry or scrubbing, her mind had been busy observing, connecting details, seeing patterns that no one else seemed to notice. The ranch's problems ran deeper than a lazy foreman or a thieving hand. Your water rights, she began, her voice even and measured. You have primary rights to Stone Creek according to the maps in this office. But the creek is running lower than it should be for this time of year, even with the dry spell. Jed frowned. It's been a dry summer. It has, Cora agreed. But it's more than that. When I ride the north fence line, near the border with Mr. Thorne's property, the ground is softer, boggier, and the creek there runs slower, wider. The flow is being impeded. Jed's posture straightened. Marcus Thorne was his neighbor to the north, a man with a large, prosperous ranch and an even larger appetite for land. He had made no secret of his desire to acquire Stone Creek, mostly for its superior water rights. Thorne, Jed said, the name a curse. He's tried to claim my water before. Took him to court over it 5 years back. The judge sided with me. A judge's ruling doesn't stop a man from building a slow, quiet dam out of rocks and fallen timber, a little at a time, where no one is likely to look, Cora said. It wouldn't be enough to stop the creek, not at first. Just enough to divert a portion of the flow into that little reservoir he has on his side of the line. Over time, it would make his pasture greener and yours drier. Jed stared at her, his mind racing. He had been riding the fence lines himself, but he'd been looking for broken wire and sick cattle. He hadn't been looking at the flow of the water, hadn't noticed the subtle shift in the landscape. He'd been fighting fires, while Thorne was patiently, insidiously changing the course of the river. And that's not all, Cora continued, her confidence growing as she saw he was truly listening. She opened a drawer in the desk and pulled out a stack of receipts held together by a piece of string. These are the bills from the freight office for the last year, for shared fence repair along the border with Thorne's land. He sends his man into town to buy the wire and posts, and then sends you a bill for half the cost. That's the agreement, Jed said, though a new line of doubt was etched on his forehead. The prices on these receipts are 20% higher than what the same materials cost if you buy them directly, Cora stated flatly. I asked the clerk at the general store last time Billy went in for supplies. Mr. Thorne is not just billing you for half the cost. He's billing you for half of an inflated cost, and pocketing the difference. It's not much on any single bill. $1 here, 50 cents there. But over the course of a year, she gestured to the neat column of figures she had tallied on a separate sheet of paper. It adds up to nearly $100. $100. To a man like Marcus Thorne, it was pocket change. To Jedediah Stone, it was the price of a good bull or a month's wages for 2 hands. It was the difference between breaking even and falling deeper into debt. The theft was not just in the money, it was in the contempt. Thorne was bleeding him dry, dollar by dollar, drop by drop, confident that Jed was too beaten down to notice. Jed sank into the chair opposite the desk, the bridle slipping from his grasp and falling to the floor with a soft jingle. He looked at the woman across from him, at the quiet intelligence in her eyes. She hadn't just found a leak, she had uncovered a conspiracy. She had shown him, with irrefutable logic and meticulously gathered evidence, the true nature of the war he was in. It wasn't a war of bad luck, it was a war of attrition, and he was losing. How? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. How did you see all this? I look at a ranch like I look at a kitchen, Cora said, picking up the skillet again, her hands needing a task. You see the big things, the stove, the table, the sink. I see the details, the level of flour in the bin, the price of salt, the way a floorboard creaks when it's about to give way. A ranch is just a bigger kitchen. It all has to balance, the water in, the grass out, the money spent, the value gained. Your books weren't balancing. The metaphor was so simple, So practical, and yet so profound. He, a rancher his entire life, had never thought of it that way. He had seen it as a battle against nature, a wrestling match with fate. She saw it as a system, an economy, a household that needed to be managed. A new feeling began to dawn in Jedediah's chest, pushing aside the weariness and the anger. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time, the sharp, clear relief of not being alone. He had been fighting this war on his own for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to have an ally. Not just a hired hand, but a partner, a strategist. "What do we do?" he asked. The word hung in the air between them. We. It was a landmark, a turning point. He was no longer giving orders, he was seeking counsel. Cora had already thought it through. Her solution was as practical and direct as she was. "First, you ride out to the north fence line tomorrow with Abel. He's been on this land longer than anyone. He'll know what the creek is supposed to look like. You document what you find. You take pictures." She nodded toward the dusty box camera on a high shelf that hadn't been touched in years. "Then you don't confront Thorne. Not yet. You send a letter to the land office in the capital, along with a copy of the original water rights survey and the new photographs. You ask for a federal marshal to come and adjudicate." Jed's eyes widened. A federal marshal. It was a bold move, escalating the conflict far beyond a local dispute. "Thorne is a bully," Cora explained. "He's used to intimidating local sheriffs and judges who eat at his table. He won't be able to bully a man sent from the capital. As for the fence supplies," she added, tapping the pile of receipts, "you simply stop paying his bills. The next time he sends one, you send back a polite letter with a copy of the price list from the general store, stating that you will be happy to pay your half of the actual cost and you will be purchasing your own supplies from now on. You don't accuse him of theft. You simply present him with the facts. It will show him that you are no longer blind." It was brilliant. It was a two-pronged attack, one legal and one economic, both executed with a quiet precision that would infuriate Thorne while giving him no legitimate grounds for open retaliation. It was a plan born not of anger, but of cold, clear-eyed strategy. Jedediah Stone looked across the desk at Cora Halloran. The last light of the day was slanting through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air around her. She looked tired, her face smudged, her hands rough from a day of hard labor. But in that moment, he thought she was the most formidable person he had ever met. She was not just running his house, she was saving his ranch. "All right," he said, the word coming out with a new strength. He stood up, his back straight. "We'll do it your way." He picked the bridle up from the floor. "I'll ride out with Abel at first light." He paused at the door. "Cora." "Yes?" "Thank you." This time the words came easily. They were not for the meal or the clean floor. They were for the map she had just given him, the one that showed him the way out of the wilderness. Cora simply nodded, and as he left, she finally allowed herself a small, deep breath. The 30-day trial was over. Something new, something far more complicated and far more promising had just begun. The threat, when it finally materialized, did not come in the form of a legal notice from Marcus Thorne or a heated confrontation at the fence line. It came from the sky. The letter to the land office had been sent. The quiet refusal to pay Thorne's inflated bills had been enacted. An uneasy peace, pregnant with unspoken menace, had settled over the valley. Thorne had been seen riding his property line more often, his face a thundercloud, but he had made no direct move. He was waiting. And so, it seemed, was nature. It began with a change in the light. The sharp, brilliant clarity of the high country autumn gave way to a strange yellow-gray haze. The air grew heavy, still, and unnaturally warm for late October. Abel, his old bones acting as a more reliable barometer than any instrument, sniffed the air one morning and looked to the bruised-looking cloud bank massing on the northwestern horizon. "Snow eater," he'd muttered to Billy. Chinook whined. "Feels warm, but it's pulling a blizzard right behind it, a bad one." Jedediah, emboldened by Cora's strategy and the tangible improvements on the ranch, had made a decision. The bank in the territorial capital had finally agreed to consider refinancing his loan, but the banker, a cautious man, insisted on an in-person meeting. It was a 3-day ride each way, a journey he was loath to make, but it was their only chance to get the capital they needed to survive the winter and invest in new stock come spring. "It's a risk. Leaving now," he'd said to Cora the night before he left, the two of them standing on the porch. watching that ominous sky. "It's a bigger risk not to," she had replied. "We have a plan. We have to see it through. The ranch will be fine. Abel knows the weather and Billy is a hard worker. We can handle whatever comes." Her confidence was a tonic to him. He'd left at dawn, turning back once at the crest of the ridge to see the light from the kitchen window, a small, steady beacon in the vast landscape. It was the first time in years he had left Stone Creek without the gnawing fear that it would collapse in his absence. The first day after he left, the Chinook wind arrived, warm and unsettling. The cattle were restless. The second day, the wind died abruptly, and a deep, penetrating cold began to seep out of the ground. The sky turned the color of lead. That was when Billy came riding in hard from the upper pastures, his face pale with alarm. "Cora!" he yelled, skidding his horse to a halt in the yard. "It's the North herd! They're gone!" Cora came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Abel, who had been repairing a harness nearby, straightened up, his eyes already on the sky. "What do you mean, gone?" Cora asked, her voice sharp with focus. "They're not in the north pasture," Billy said, breathing hard. "The fence is down. Not broken, mind you. The wires were cut, clean as a whistle. And the whole herd, maybe 50 head, they're just gone. Tracks lead up toward the Box Canyon." The Box Canyon. The words hung in the freezing air. It was a natural trap, a deep ravine with steep walls and only one narrow entrance. If a herd was driven in there and the entrance blocked, they were stuck. Abel spat on the ground, his face grim. "Thorne," he said. It wasn't a question. "He knows about the blizzard. He's driven our cattle into that canyon. He'll wait for the storm to hit, let it snow them in. Then, come spring, he'll find them on his property, or what's left of them, rebrand the survivors, claim them as strays that wandered in during the storm." It was a classic, ruthless tactic. By the time Jedediah got back and the snow cleared enough to search, it would be too late. The evidence would be buried under 10 feet of snow. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to rise in Cora's throat. Jed was gone. The telegraph lines she knew were notoriously unreliable and would be the first thing to go down in a storm. They were cut off. The ranch's most valuable assets, 50 pregnant heifers, were trapped and a monster of a storm was bearing down on them. They had only 3 hands: Abel, old and stiff; Billy, young and willing but inexperienced; and another man, Hank, who was steady but not a leader; and herself, a woman, and her son, who was watching from the doorway, his small face a mask of silent worry. For a moment, the sheer weight of the crisis pressed down on her. This was it. The move Thorne had been waiting to make. He had waited until Jed was gone, until the ranch was at its most vulnerable. He thought he was dealing with a skeleton crew he could easily outmaneuver. He was counting on their despair, on their powerlessness. Cora looked at the faces of her small crew. She saw fear in Billy's eyes. She saw grim resignation in Abel's. She knew they were looking to her, though they might not have realized it. Jed had left her in charge, not in word, but in deed. His trust had been a gift. Now it was a burden. She took a deep breath, the frigid air burning her lungs. She could panic or she could work. She had always chosen work. "All right," she said, her voice cutting through the frightened stillness. It was a voice that did not brook argument or despair. It was the voice of a general taking command of a battlefield. "Thorne thinks he's won. He's counting on us to wait for Jed, to give up. We're not going to." She turned and went into the office, the men following at her heels. She strode to the wall where the large, hand-drawn survey map of the ranch was tacked. It was old, the paper yellowed, but the lines were dark and clear. Her finger traced the boundaries of the property, finding the jagged slash that represented the Box Canyon. "He's driven them in here," she said, tapping the entrance. "And he's probably blocked it with brush or a felled tree. He thinks they're trapped. He thinks the only way out is the way they came in." "It is the only way," Abel said, his voice heavy. "Those walls are sheer rock. I've been in that canyon 100 times. "The walls are sheer for cattle," Cora said, her eyes scanning the intricate contour lines on the map, lines she had studied late at night by lamplight, memorizing the lay of the land she now called home. "But what about for game? Deer? Elk?" Her finger moved from the canyon floor up to the high ridge that formed its western wall. She traced a faint, dotted line that snaked its way up the steep incline. "What's this?" Abel squinted, leaning closer. "That's nothing. Just an old game trail, too steep and narrow for cattle. They'd break their legs. It's barely passable for a man on foot." "But it is passable," Cora insisted. And it leads up to the high meadow which connects back to our south pasture. She looked up from the map, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce idea. We're not going to drive them out the front. We're going to lead them out the back. Billy and Abel stared at her as if she'd gone mad. Lead them? Billy stammered. Up that? Cora, they'll panic. They'll stampede. We'll lose them all over the side. Not if we don't spook them, Cora said, her mind working faster now, the plan taking shape. We don't go in with ropes and shouts. We go in with feed. We go in quiet. We get them on their feet, and we use their own herd instinct. If we can get the lead cow started up that trail, the rest will follow, slowly, one by one. She looked at Abel. We have hay, right? The good alfalfa from the barn loft. Aye, we do, Abel said, a glimmer of understanding dawning in his old eyes. And we have what's left of the molasses, she continued, her energy filling the small cold room. Billy, you and Hank will load up 2 pack mules with bales of hay. Abel, you know that trail better than anyone. You'll go on foot and clear any loose rock, find the safest path. I'll mix a sweet feed with the molasses. We'll use it to coax the led animals. We won't push them, we'll bribe them. It was an audacious, unconventional plan. Ranching wisdom said you drove cattle with pressure and force. She was proposing to lead them with patience and temptation. It went against every instinct they had. But it was also the only plan they had. The alternative was to do nothing, to let 50 head of prime stock, the future of the ranch, freeze to death in a trap set by their enemy. The storm, Billy began, looking toward the window. The sky was visibly darker now, and the first few hard grains of snow, like pellets of sand, had begun to tick against the glass. The storm is our clock, Cora said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. We have maybe 5 hours of usable light, maybe less. We move now. She turned and looked at them, her small, determined crew. Jedediah Stone trusted us to watch his ranch. Marcus Thorne thinks we're sheep. Let's show him what we are. There was a moment of silence. Then Abel, the old sage, the man of few words, gave a single, sharp nod. The woman's right, he said, his voice a low rasp. Get the mules, Billy. That was all it took. The fear in the room was replaced by a new, urgent energy. Billy ran for the barn, Hank on his heels. Abel grabbed his sturdiest walking stick and a coil of rope. Cora was already in the kitchen, her hands flying as she mixed oats, barley, and the precious, sticky molasses into a bucket. She worked with a fierce, focused calm. As she measured and mixed, she saw her son, Leo, standing in the kitchen doorway. He held the small wooden horse Billy had given him. His eyes were wide, but not with fear, with a kind of solemn understanding. He was watching his mother go to war. She paused, walked over to him, and knelt down so they were eye to eye. I have to go out for a while, Leo, she said softly. There's work to do. There's bread on the table and stew in the pot. You stay inside where it's warm. You keep the fire going. Can you do that for me? The boy looked at her, then gave a firm, serious nod. He understood. This was his job. He was part of the crew. Cora pulled on her husband's old sheepskin coat, which was too big in the shoulders but wonderfully warm. She put on her gloves and settled her hat firmly on her head. When she stepped outside, the team was assembled. 2 mules stood patiently, laden with bales of hay. Abel was mounted, his face set. Billy and Hank were ready. The snow was coming down faster now, not in flakes, but in a driving, horizontal sleet that stung the skin. The world was fading to gray. Cora swung up into the saddle of the steady mare Jed had left for her. She took the bucket of sweet feed from Billy, its smell a strange, hopeful perfume in the frozen air. She looked at the small force gathered around her. A boy, an old man, and a solid hand. It wasn't an army, but it was a fellowship. Let's go get our cattle, she said, and turned her horse toward the north. The ride to the box canyon was a battle against the wind. The snow was not falling so much as it was being hurled at them, a fine, stinging powder that worked its way into every gap in their clothing and coated their eyebrows and mustaches in ice. The world had shrunk to a swirling vortex of white and gray. Cora kept her head down, the brim of her hat pulled low, following the familiar shape of the fence line, trusting her horse to keep its footing on the increasingly treacherous ground. They found the entrance to the canyon just as she had predicted. A large pine tree, freshly cut, had been dragged across the narrow opening, its branches interwoven with thick brush. It was Thorn's work, no doubt, quick, effective, and brutal. Abel dismounted, his old joints protesting, and began to assess the blockage. He did this proper, he grunted, pulling at a branch. Meant for it to hold. We're not going through it, Cora reminded him, her voice raised against the howl of the wind. We're going over. Where's the trail? Abel pointed a gloved finger up the steep, rocky cliff face to their right. Starts there, behind that stand of aspen. Cora looked. What she saw was less a trail and more a faint, winding scar on the face of the rock, barely wide enough for a single animal. It looked impossible. But the map had said it was there. And right now, the map was all she had. All right, she called out. Abel, you lead the way on foot. Clear what you can. Billy, you and Hank stay here with the mules. When we get the herd moving, start tossing hay up the first part of the trail. Give them a reason to climb. She dismounted, handing her reins to Billy. She took the bucket of sweet feed. Wish us luck, she said, and followed Abel toward the base of the cliff. The climb was grueling. The game trail was slick with a thin layer of ice and snow. They had to move slowly, testing each foothold, using their hands to grip outcroppings of rock and frozen roots. The wind tore at them, trying to peel them from the mountainside. Cora's lungs burned with the effort and the cold. The bucket of feed felt impossibly heavy. Below, the cattle were a huddled, miserable mass of brown and black against the rapidly whitening ground. They were bunched together for warmth, their heads low, already resigning themselves to their fate. It took them the better part of an hour to work their way down the treacherous inner slope of the canyon. When they finally reached the floor, they were behind the herd, a good 100 yards from the blocked entrance. The cattle shifted nervously at their appearance, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Easy now, Cora said, her voice a low murmur. She walked slowly, not directly at them, but in a wide, calm arc. Abel followed her lead, his movements slow and deliberate. This was the most dangerous part. If they panicked, they would stampede toward the blocked entrance, trampling each other, breaking legs. It would be a slaughter. Cora began to talk to them, the same low, soothing stream of nonsense she had used on the sick calf. She held out the bucket, letting the wind carry the sweet, tempting smell of molasses and oats toward them. A few heads came up. A big, older cow, her belly heavy with calf, turned her head and watched Cora's approach, her dark eyes curious. She was the one, the matriarch, the lead cow. That's it, girl, Cora crooned, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. Just for you. Something good. She stopped about 10 feet away from the cow and set the bucket down. She scooped out a handful of the feed and held it out on her flat palm. The cow watched her, hesitating. The rest of the herd was watching the cow. The entire fate of the Stone Creek Ranch hung in the balance of this one animal's decision. Cora did not move. She did not blink. She just stood there, a small, frozen figure offering a handful of grain against the fury of the storm. The cow took a hesitant step forward, then another. She stretched out her thick neck and sniffed at Cora's glove. Her warm, wet nose touched Cora's frozen palm. Her rough tongue came out and swept the grain into her mouth. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the herd. Their leader had deemed this new thing safe. Cora offered another handful and then another, drawing the cow slowly, step by step, away from the herd and toward the base of the trail she and Abel had just descended. The cow followed, her focus entirely on the promise of more feed. Now, Abel, Cora said under her breath. The old man, who had circled around, began to move slowly behind the main body of the herd. Not shouting, but simply making his presence known, applying a gentle, constant pressure that encouraged them to follow their leader. One by one, then in small groups, the cattle began to drift after the big cow, moving toward the base of the game trail. When the lead cow reached the incline, she paused, eyeing the steep, narrow path with suspicion. This was the second crucible. Cora didn't push. She simply walked a few feet up the trail herself and set down a small pile of the sweet feed. From below, Billy, seeing his cue, began tossing handfuls of the fragrant alfalfa onto the first 20 feet of the path. The smell of the good hay, combined with the lure of the molasses, was too much to resist. The big cow lowered her head, took a tentative step up, and began to eat. Behind her, the next cow followed, and the one after that. A slow, single-file line of cattle began to snake its way up the impossible trail. It was a painstaking, heart-stopping process. The trail was narrow, and a single misstep could send an animal tumbling. Cora and Abel moved along the line, talking to the animals, keeping them calm, their voices a constant, reassuring presence in the storm. Billy and Hank kept the trail ahead, baited with hay, a breadcrumb path leading them towards salvation. Halfway up, a young heifer slipped, her back legs skidding off the edge. She bawled in terror, threatening to send a wave of panic through the entire line. Before anyone could react, Abel was there. He grabbed her by the horns, his old man's strength astonishing, and literally shoved her back onto the path, his face inches from hers. "Get on, you fool girl," he roared, his voice a crack of thunder. The heifer, shocked into submission, scrambled to her feet and hurried on. The light was failing fast. The snow was a blinding wall of white. They were operating now in a ghostly twilight, their world reduced to the dark shapes of the cattle and the narrow, treacherous ribbon of the trail. Cora's coat was frozen stiff, her face was numb, but she did not stop. She moved up and down the line, her presence a constant reassurance, her voice a low anchor in the chaos of the storm. She saw Silas then, not the man himself, but his ghost. She saw his sneer, heard his grumbling about a woman's place. She thought of Marcus Thorne, sitting warm in his fine house, confident that his plan had worked, that the Stone Creek herd was freezing in his trap. A cold, hard anger, more potent than the wind, rose in her. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated this ranch. They had mistaken quiet competence for weakness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead cow crested the ridge and stepped out onto the relative safety of the high meadow. A low bellow from her signaled the end of the trail, and the pace of the animals behind her quickened. In a steady stream, the cattle of the Stone Creek Ranch poured out of the canyon and onto the high ground. They had done it. They were all there, 50 head, not a single one lost. Exhaustion hit Cora like a physical blow. She leaned against a rock, the empty feed bucket dropping from her numb fingers. Billy and Hank were there, their faces red with cold and alight with triumph. Abel was leaning on his walking stick, a rare, wide grin splitting his wrinkled face. They looked at each other, this small, frozen, exhausted band of rebels, and a shared, unspoken understanding passed between them. They had faced the worst, and they had won. Not with force, but with intelligence. Not with bluster, but with a woman's audacious, brilliant plan. The storm was now a full-blown blizzard. Getting the herd down from the high meadow and back to the shelter of the south pasture was another ordeal, but it was a straightforward one. They were on home territory now. The wind was at their backs. As they finally pushed the last of the weary cattle into the sheltered pasture near the main barn, the lights of the ranch house shone through the swirling snow. A beacon, a promise of warmth and safety. Leo had kept the fire going. The kitchen was warm and bright. Cora stumbled in, pulling off her frozen gloves, her whole body aching with a deep, satisfying weariness. Billy and Abel followed, their faces etched with exhaustion, but also with a fierce, newfound pride. They had not just saved the cattle, they had saved the ranch, and in doing so, they had forged themselves into something new. They were no longer just Jedediah Stone's hired hands. They were Cora's crew. Jedediah Stone returned 3 days later to a world buried in white. The blizzard had been as bad as Abel had predicted, leaving drifts as high as the barn eaves. He'd had to leave his horse a mile out and fight his way through the snow on foot, his mind filled with a cold dread. He expected to find a scene of devastation, a ranch crippled by the storm, his best cattle lost. Instead, he found peace. He found the yard shoveled, smoke curling cheerfully from the chimney of the house, and the sound of his cattle lowing, safe and content, in the sheltered south pasture. All 50 of them. He found his crew in the kitchen, drinking hot coffee. They were tired, but they were not defeated. There was a new energy in the room, a new camaraderie in the way they looked at each other. Billy, his face beaming, launched into the story before Jed could even pull off his snow-caked coat. He told him everything. The cut fence, Thorne's trap, the impossible game trail, the sweet feed, the long, desperate climb in the heart of the storm. He told it not as a story of his own heroism, but as a story of Cora's leadership. "She saved them, boss," Billy finished, his voice full of awe. "She looked at a map and came up with a plan that none of us would have thought of in 100 years. And she led us, right into the teeth of it." Abel, stirring his coffee, just nodded. "The boy's right," he said. "Never seen anything like it. She's got more grit and more sense than any 10 men I've ever known." Jedediah listened, his gaze shifting to Cora. She was standing by the stove, her back to him, kneading a massive ball of dough for the next day's bread. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't sought any praise. She was simply working, her hands moving with the same steady, purposeful rhythm as always. She had faced down his nemesis, defied a blizzard, and saved the future of his ranch, and now she was making bread. He walked over to the stove, his boots heavy on the clean floor. "Cora," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She stopped kneading but did not turn around. "Your coffee's on the table, Jedediah. You must be frozen." "The loan," he said, ignoring the coffee. "I got it." The banker was impressed by the new ledgers, by the plan for the water rights. He paused. He said the ranch finally looked like a sound investment. She finally turned to face him. Her hands were white with flour. There were tired lines around her eyes, but they shone with a clear, calm light. "That's good news," she said softly. "That's not the news," he said. He looked past her, at the men at the table, at the warm, orderly kitchen, at the whole transformed world she had built inside his failing one. He looked back at her. "I came back expecting to find a ranch, but this is a home." He took a step closer. The 30-day agreement felt like a lifetime ago, a foolish bargain made by a blind and desperate man. "That agreement we had," he said. "It's over." Cora's expression didn't change, but he saw a subtle tightening in her shoulders. She thought he was letting her go. "I see," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "No," he said quickly, "you don't." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently took one of her flour-dusted hands in his own. Her skin was rough, but warm. "I'm not offering you a wage anymore, Cora. A wage isn't right for what you are, for what you've done." He took a deep breath, the words feeling momentous, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. "I'm offering you a partnership, half of everything. The land, the cattle, the house, half the profits, half the debts, half the work. Your name on the deed next to mine, Stone and Halloran. I'm asking you to stay, not as a housekeeper, but as my partner." The kitchen went utterly silent. Billy's jaw was on the floor. Abel was watching with an intensely satisfied expression. Cora stared at him, her gray eyes searching his face. She saw no pity there, no charity. She saw respect. She saw a man offering her a seat at his own table, not as a guest, but as an equal. She had arrived with nothing but 2 carpet bags and a silent child, looking for a refuge. She had been offered a kingdom, not a kingdom of riches and ease, but a kingdom of hard work, of shared burdens, of fierce loyalties, a kingdom of home. She looked at her hand, held in his. She looked at her son, Leo, who had come to stand beside her, his small hand clutching her skirt. He was looking up at Jedediah, not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity. "Yes," Cora said, the word small but solid as a rock. "Yes, we'll stay." Music. Months later, the last of the snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, and the valley was awash in the tender green of spring. The Stone Creek Ranch, or rather the Stone and Halloran Ranch, as the new sign over the gate now proudly proclaimed, was thriving. The creek, its flow restored after a visit from a very stern federal marshal, ran full and clear. The cattle, fat and healthy, were scattered across the greening pastures, and among them were dozens of new calves, knock-kneed and full of life. Marcus Thorne kept to his side of the fence line, his power broken not by violence, but by a well-written letter and a meticulously balanced ledger. The evening sun cast a long, golden light across the porch of the ranch house. Jedediah sat in his old rocking chair, cleaning a rifle, his movements slow and content. He was a different man. The weariness had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet strength. He was no longer a man carrying a burden alone. Cora came out and sat on the top step, a basket of mending in her lap. She wore a simple blue dress, and the setting sun caught the warm highlights in her hair. There was a peace about her, the deep, settled peace of a person who has found their place in the world. The ranch that had been on its knees had not just gotten a hand, it had gotten a heart. The woman who had needed a refuge had not just found a job, she had built a home. From the corral, a new sound drifted up to them. It was Leo. He was standing on the bottom rail of the fence, pointing a small, excited finger. Billy was with him, holding the lead rope of a newborn foal, all legs and wide, innocent eyes. "Look, Mama," Leo called out, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the quiet yard. "Look, Jed, he's got my horse's color." Jedediah stopped his work. Cora's hands stilled in her lap. They looked at each other, a slow smile spreading across both their faces. It was the first full sentence Leo had spoken in over a year. It was the sound of a root taking hold in good soil. It was the sound of the future. Jedediah put the rifle aside, and Cora set down her mending. Together, they sat on the porch of their home, listening to the sound of their son's voice, a quiet testament to the fact that the most broken things can be mended, the most silent places can be filled with life, and the most desperate journeys can lead to the one place you were always meant to be.